All right, to help us get a bit more context about the moment, we're joined by Scott Warren, a fellow at the SNF Agora Institute at Johns Hopkins University.
And Warren leads work focused on building pro-democracy, a conservative agenda in the U.S. with a particular focus on election trust, on how Americans think about democracy and political identity. So let's start with the big picture. I appreciate you being with us. What is the big picture here? What do the rallies tell you really about the political moment in this country?
Thanks so much for having me. A pleasure to be here. And yeah, I mean, I was just listening into your coverage, and obviously there are millions of people across the country that are showing up in big cities and small cities to show how they feel about this administration. I think the fact that this is the third time that these rallies are happening says something. I also think that the devil is going to be in the details in terms of, as you all were saying, what happens from here. I think the fact that people are organizing on the streets is symbolically important. What needs to happen for change to occur is that this has to turn into a constituency that mobilizes beyond just protest days every few months, and actually takes action on specific issues. And I think the other thing that probably is important with these protests is how much of this is an anti-Trump protest and how much of it is about bigger issues pertaining into democracy in this country. And I think we'll see sort of how that plays out. So the fact that there's so many people protesting shows a lot, but there's still a lot that has to happen for these protests to translate into real action.
So, Scott, piggybacking off of that idea about democracy, from what we've heard from the demonstrators there, this go around and the last was that they believe that there is a real existential threat to democracy at this point. Is that a legitimate concern based on the actions of the Trump administration up until this point?
I think that you're seeing a lot of indices demonstrate that democracy in this country is backsliding. You just had Freedom House come out with a report saying that U.S. democracy is on the downswing, as did a report called VDEM. And so you're seeing some of these objective reports come out and say that that democracy is on a downward swing. And I think that there have been actions that the Trump administration has taken that suggest a high degree of executive overreach, that suggests that they're not listening or really trying to work through Congress. And so I do think that there is a need for protesters to, and this is hard to do in this moment in time, but to distinguish between what are factors that might actually demonstrate that democracy is at risk, and what's policy that people don't like. And I think that's always something that's a little bit challenging. Deportations are something that the executive government can engage in. How they're engaging in these deportations is probably something that is beyond the pale in terms of our democracy. You're seeing similar things with the war in Iran. Going to war without congressional assent is something that is problematic. It's something that other administrations have done. But I think that democracy in this country has been declining for a number of years now. And the Trump administration seems to be a byproduct of that. And so getting a little bit more specific in terms of what that means is important. That said, I know people are in the streets. They're not going to get very nuanced in terms of what that means. But I think the distinction between we don't like this policy and democracy is at risk is always important to think about.
And Scott, as we have you up here, we're also looking at footage from protests here across the country. A major turnout here. I think the big question for a lot of people is, how do you take that momentum and how do you actually turn it into policy change? Midterm elections coming up. And I think that is really what a lot of people are asking, is how do you take that momentum and keep it going?
Yeah, I mean, I think you've seen a lot of countries when this happens, when people are upset and they're protesting what they feel is democracy backsliding and eroding. This translates into real sustained action. Sometimes you see general strikes. You saw some of that in Minnesota, when you had the ICE raids happening there. So what's taking protests on the streets to actions that actually make it somewhat uncomfortable to go about everyday life? I think that's one thing that we'll see if that happens. This is actually translate into real sustained action. The other thing is you need these actions to translate into to real constituencies. I think a good amount to ask for people to, to protest on a Saturday. But are they going to, organize in their communities? Are they going to, campaign for folks that they want to win? Voting is one part of that I saw in the previous segment, but it's so much more than that. And so I think that one risk of this is, are you just asking people to come back and back and back to protest? Are they going to see change? How are you actually mobilizing people in their communities? And so I'm curious how much the protest organizers are thinking about that in terms of actually creating a constituency behind this that's not just about the Democratic Party, but about beyond that. Versus, we're going to have the next No Kings protest in another 6 weeks. I think we got it. The organizers have to figure out how they get beyond these protests, which are, you see these images and it's quite consequential. But if you look at throughout history, if you look at the March on Washington, that was part of something bigger. The sense of this being part of something bigger, and not just a Never Trump rally, but part of something that has a real constituency. It'll be interesting to see if that happens.
Yeah, I mean, it needs to be tied to policy. And what we've yet to hear from anyone associated with this group or others is, what specifically are you going to do on the policy front to see this agenda through in the way in which you've described? Well, I want to get to a little bit of your work, because you do a lot of work on pro-democracy conservatives. In a moment like this, I think where we're talking about trying to find common ground, which I don't think we've seen in months now up until this point, is there still room for common ground? Is that a thing of the past at this point? What's your estimation?
I mean, I not to be quaint about it, but I think that there are a lot of people in this country across the political spectrum that really do believe in small d democratic principles. A lot of the work that I'm doing is going around to states across the country, working with folks across the ideological spectrum, but including conservatives, Republican secretaries of state, Republican election administrators that are very focused on how do we ensure that we have free and fair elections in 2026, which I know is something that people are concerned about. The Trump administration has talked about federal overreach of elections. The SAVE Act is up in Congress. I think that bedrock principle of one person, one vote, ensuring that elections work is something that people across the country really do believe in. I also think, and again, not trying to be pedantic, but this is the 250th year anniversary of the country. There's an opportunity here to demonstrate what are American values and principles that we hold dear. And one of them is freedom of expression and freedom of speech. And so, I think these rallies are a byproduct of that. But I've met a lot of people across the political spectrum that really do want to get to a better place, that really do want to get, across this division. But it's gonna take work to get there. And It's going to take less demonizing of our political opponents. We've done some research at Johns Hopkins that shows that over 50% of Democrats and over 50% of Republicans don't just disagree with the opposite political party, but they see them as evil. It's going to be hard to make progress irrespective of protests and action if we see fellow Americans as fundamentally evil. And so figuring out how we get beyond that is going to be incredibly important, and is going to take more work than showing up to No Kings rallies.
And you have spent a lot of time focusing on protests, how they affect confidence in democracy. For viewers watching all these rallies unfold today, seeing the outcome, what is the big difference here between those healthy democratic dissent and these healthy conversations, people who disagree, and the kind of polarization that can really make institutions feel even weaker? And we know we have seen a lot of that over the last couple of years.
Well, I think part of it is polarization on its own is not necessarily a bad thing. It's a good thing in a democracy to disagree with one another. Where it gets bad is when you have what's called effective polarization. When you, as I was saying, demonize your political opponent, see them as less than, see them as not American. And so, even for those folks out today, they are expressing their American right to be in the streets, and that is, there's a lot of countries where, and if you think that democracy is on the downswing here, there's a lot of countries where these protests could not happen the way they're happening today. And I think that that's something, really to celebrate. I think the key is, how do you bring more people into this bigger tent, this democracy bigger tent? I think it needs to be seen as fundamentally American, not really tied to the Democratic Party per se, but is part of broader principles. And again, seeing disagreement as something that is healthy, but demonization is something that is not. And I think that's something that we've lost a bit in this country as of late.
Kind of considering history a little bit, I think history would tell us that we have these moments of tension. It sort of resolves itself, and then we sort of enter yet a new era. Does it appear that sort of what we've seen in the past will sort of play out yet again? That the way in which we've seen the women's rights movement, the gay rights movement, the civil rights movement play out, all of those moments created a amount of tension that created eventually policy that led to additional rights for women, for people of color, for the disabled. Are we potentially in that same era yet again?
Maybe. I mean, yeah, American history is one in which there's been a lot of starts and stops. There are people that say, "Oh, well, our democracy's never been as bad as it is now." We had the Civil War. We had those, the 60s where you had a high prevalency of political assassinations. And so obviously we've gotten through challenging times before. That said, this time is different, as all times are different, but this time is different just given given technology, given the discomfort that I think people are feeling in the current moment, with things like artificial intelligence, creating this notion of what our job's going to look like. There's all these factors that are coming up at the same time. And so I think that there's definitely the hope that this moves into an era, where you sort of do have Congress working, where you have people working across differences to get things done. Where honestly, in administrations, and that needs to end. But I think that it takes work to get there. We can't expect that just because other periods of tumult in this country have resulted in progress, that this time will as well. And so the hope is that we can become stronger on the other side, and both Republicans and Democrats are fearful for the state of our democracy right now. But that's definitely not guaranteed. That's something that we'll have to fight for, and probably engage in activities that might be uncomfortable. And by that I mean engaging across difference and recognizing that we all have to live together somehow. And I think that's something that we can sometimes forget about in moments like this too.
Yeah, and I think that is a point that we can at least all agree on. When it comes to protests, movement like this, it can be hard to measure success. I think it looks different for everyone. What are you specifically going to be looking for in the days and weeks ahead to show, was this a one-day movement or protest, or something that is actually going to bring policy change, something that will see an outcome in the midterm elections?
I think you have to look at whether the people at these rallies stay engaged. I remember the women's marches after the first Trump administration, after the victory of the first Trump administration. You had about 600,000 people marching in New York City, and you had less than that voted in the New York City primaries only months later. That's you have to so in that case, the action wasn't translated into the policy change you all are talking about. So do these rallies, or do you see upswings in voter registration? Do you see upswings in terms of people participating? We have a primary coming up in DC for mayor and city council. People need to participate in that, and then they need to take action on issues that they care about as well. And so I think what'll be important, maybe there'll be another No Kings rally, and the extent to which you have people continue to come to that is important. But it's sort of easy to get people out the first time, easy-ish to get people out the second, third time, not as easy to get people out a fourth and fifth time, because they want to see what their action is turning into. And so the extent to which people stay engaged is going to be important. One additional point I'll make that I think has been an important part of these rallies, they have tended, and there's been research that demonstrates this, they have tended to skewer a little on the older side. And this is to take nothing away from older individuals, but young Americans right now are really frustrated and verging on cynical with politics. And they're just, the risk is that they divorce from the system entirely, because they see it as not worth fighting for. These are young people that grew up during COVID, that Trump has come to define their entire political life. And so one other thing I'd be looking at is, can these protests, veer younger? not just, kids of parents, but, getting 20 and 30-year-olds out as well. And you look at these pictures and you're not quite seeing that. That's not the most scientific way to look at it. But I do think that, the extent to which young people are coming out is something that's a weakness right now and needs to be focused on too.
Well, it's interesting because older Americans tend to be much more politically active than we traditionally younger Americans. And it does beg the point what's being done on that front to address younger Americans that, when we think economically, are being adversely affected by things like AI and are being effectively shut out of the job market in many cases. I think sort of taking in what you've seen today from the demonstrations here, the crowds, the signs, those No Keying banners that a lot of people have, what should civic action actually look like from here today?
Yeah, I think there's a number of ways to take action. Some of it is showing up in, local community meetings and just being in local community spaces. And again, Maryland has primaries, DC has primaries. There's states across the country that are going to have primaries. It's getting active in those campaigns. It is getting in touch with your local officials, your local members of Congress, but also local state reps, state senators, talking to them about issues that you care about. I do think that in addition to finding candidates that you care about, there is going to be an important role that individuals can play in protecting the sanctity of free and fair elections in 2026. And that can include becoming poll watchers, becoming nonpartisan election observers, which is something that happens in a lot of other countries and can happen here as well. And so really paying attention to ensuring that the elections are free and fair and trusted. I think the other thing that people need to do, and you all are providing a service of this, is make sure that they're paying attention and getting news from reputable sources. This is again going back to young people. About 75% of young people are getting their news on social media, which is not necessarily a problem, but some of that can be not the most factual of news as well. And so making sure that you're getting non-biased news and that you're engaging friends and neighbors on that as well, I think is important. So part of it is just making sure that you're acting politically, not partisan, but politically every single day, in terms of paying attention, getting involved in local communities, and doing what you can to protect the sanctity of elections in 2026 too.
Scott, before we let you go, I just want to touch on something that you mentioned, because you've said it twice now. You've talked about elections. Do you have a legitimate concern that the policies that the Trump administration is trying to enact, that according to them, they say are going to strengthen elections in this country, do you feel that it will do otherwise?
I think that there is a reasonable case to make that the Trump administration is engaging in behavior that would erode trust in elections at the best, and there might be interventions that do more than that in the worst. The push to federalize elections in this country have always been locally run. That's a bedrock of our Constitution. You have it. It looks highly unlikely the SAVE Act will pass. But that's still going to be used by the Trump administration to say that there's undocumented immigrants voting, which is not happening. So I think that there's definitely the case that they're going to sow distrust. I think the good news is that elections in this country are still locally run, and so I've had the privilege and opportunity of meeting folks across the political spectrum that are running elections in Idaho, in Kansas, in Arizona, in Georgia, Wisconsin, that are doing an incredible job. And so I think that what gives me hope right now is that you have regularly or everyday Americans that are running elections, and we need to provide them support right now. But I think that it can't be taken for granted that the administration sees these midterms as existential. Democrats see these midterms as existential. Every election for the last few decades has seemed existential, and it means that there's a higher risk that there could be malevolent intervention in elections.
All right, Scott Warren from the SNF Agora Institute at Johns Hopkins. We really appreciate your time and all your insight.
Thanks so much for having me.